A dead man with a borrowed identity, a suitcase full of lies, and a cold drop into the Atlantic Ocean changed the entire course of World War II. By the spring of 1943, the Allied powers had a problem that no amount of firepower could solve directly. North Africa was secured. The German and Italian forces that had dominated the desert for 2 years had been broken, pushed back, and finally crushed between British forces from the east and American forces from the west. Tunisia had fallen. Over 200,000 Axis troops had surrendered in May 1943, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad. The question now sitting in front of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and every senior Allied commander was the question that had been sitting there since America entered the war in December 1941. How do you get back into Europe? The answer, geographically, was almost insultingly obvious. Sicily. The large triangular island sitting at the toe of the Italian boot was the natural stepping stone from North Africa into southern Europe. It was close enough that Allied air power from Tunisia could provide cover. It was the logical route. It was so logical, in fact, that every military mind on both sides of the war understood it immediately when they looked at a map, including the Germans. Adolf Hitler had already told his generals that Sicily was the obvious Allied target. German and Italian forces were reinforcing the island. Defensive positions were being strengthened. Troops were being positioned. The beaches where any invasion fleet would have to land were being covered with guns. The Allies were heading into a prepared defense on an island that the enemy was fully expecting them to attack. The casualties that kind of assault produces are not something that military planners write about comfortably. You do not describe in clean language what happens to young men in landing craft hitting defended beaches when the defenders know exactly where you are coming and have had months to prepare for your arrival. Somebody in British intelligence decided there had to be another way. The room where Operation Mincemeat was born was not a dramatic place. It was a London office. Men in suits and uniforms sitting around a table in 1943 doing what British intelligence did better than almost anyone else during that war, thinking carefully and creatively about how to make the enemy believe something that was not true. The core idea was not entirely new. A document called the Trout Memo, written in 1939 by an admiral named John Godfrey and largely drafted by his personal assistant, a young intelligence officer named Ian Fleming, who would later become famous for creating a fictional spy named James Bond, had outlined various methods of deceiving the enemy using unconventional approaches. One idea buried in that document was this: plant false documents on a dead body, float it toward enemy territory, let them find it. The idea had never been used. Two men decided 1943 was the time. Ewen Montagu was a naval intelligence officer, barrister by training, meticulous by nature, possessed of the kind of mind that noticed which details would convince and which would fail. Charles Cholmondeley was a RAF intelligence officer, quieter, equally precise, with a particular gift for working through problems from every angle simultaneously. Together, they took a concept that sounded like a bad thriller novel and turned it into one of the most precisely executed deception operations in military history. The first problem was the body. This was not a detail that could be improvised. The entire operation required a real human corpse, and not just any corpse. It needed to be a body in a physical condition consistent with having drowned at sea after an aircraft crash. It needed to be someone whose death would not be noticed, questioned, or investigated. It needed a body that could survive the practical requirements of what was being planned: refrigeration, transportation, and eventual discovery in the Atlantic Ocean without giving anything away to the Spanish authorities, who would almost certainly find it. Montagu and Cholmondeley worked with a pathologist named Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of the most respected forensic experts in Britain, to understand exactly what a drowned man's body looked like and what examination might reveal. The body they eventually obtained belonged to a Welshman named Glyndwr. He was 34 years old. He had died in London in January 1943 after ingesting rat poison. Whether accidentally or deliberately was never entirely established. He had no family who came forward. He had died essentially alone in a city that was too consumed by the demands of a world war to pause over individual tragedies happening in its streets. His death went unnoticed. His next role would change history. Glyndwr was about to become Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The creation of William Martin was an exercise in thoroughness that bordered on obsession, and had to, because German intelligence was good enough that any detail which seemed wrong would unravel everything. Montagu and his team built a complete human life for a man who had never existed. They gave him a service number. They created his pay records. They made him a combined operations courier, someone whose job would explain both his presence on an aircraft and his possession of extremely sensitive documents. They gave him a personal life. A photograph of a young woman was obtained, a woman who worked in the War Office, who agreed to pose as William Martin's fiancée. Her name, for the purposes of the operation, was Pam. Love letters were written between them, not official or stiff letters, but genuinely warm, slightly anxious letters of the kind that people actually write when they are in love, and one of them is heading into danger. Letters discussing their upcoming wedding. Letters full of small personal details that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with two people who had found each other in the middle of one. A receipt from a jeweler for an engagement ring was included. A letter from William Martin's father, stern, slightly cold, the kind of letter a certain type of English father of that generation actually wrote, was created and placed among the papers. A letter from his bank complaining about an overdraft was included. A London theatre ticket stub was placed in his pocket. A bill from his club. A photograph of Pam at the beach found in his wallet. A St. Christopher's medal around his neck, keys in his pocket. Every item had been thought about, debated, and selected because it told a specific story about a specific man who had lived a specific life. The letters, the ring receipt, the bank notice, the theatre stub. These were not props. They were a human being, assembled on paper. But the personal details were the frame. The picture inside the frame was the documents, and those documents were where Mincemeat became something that could actually change the war. Through careful channels, Montagu obtained approval to create genuine high-level correspondence, letters between actual senior Allied commanders whose names the Germans would recognize and whose authority the Germans would not question. The letters discussed, in appropriately careful military language, the upcoming Allied operations in the Mediterranean. The letters indicated that the invasion would not target Sicily. Sicily, the letters suggested with the practiced subtlety of men who understood that a secret revealed too obviously stops being believed, was merely a deception target. Something the Allies wanted the Germans to think was the real objective, while the actual operations were directed elsewhere. The real targets, the letters implied, were Sardinia and Greece. Greece particularly. The letters discussed logistics, timing, command arrangements, and various operational considerations in a way that read exactly as genuine high-level military correspondence should, because they were written by people who had spent years reading genuine high-level military correspondence and understood precisely how it felt on the page. These letters were placed in a briefcase. The briefcase was chained to the body of William Martin. The submarine HMS Seraph sailed from Holy Loch in Scotland on April the 19th, 1943. Her crew had been told only what they needed to know for their part of the mission. A canister was loaded aboard under conditions of tight security. Most of the crew understood they were carrying something important and unusual. Most of them did not know what. The canister contained dry ice and the body of Glyndwr, William Martin, preserved carefully for the journey. Commander Norman Jewell of HMS Seraph had been fully briefed. He knew what was in the canister. He knew what had to happen. In the early morning darkness of April the 30th, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced approximately 1 mile off Punta Umbria on the southwestern coast of Spain, near the port city of Huelva. The canister was opened on the deck. The body of William Martin, dressed in his Royal Marines uniform, his briefcase chained to his wrist, his love letters in his pocket, his theatre stubs and bank notices and engagement ring receipt all in place, was placed in the water. His May West life preserver was inflated so the body would float. A rubber dinghy was placed in the water nearby to suggest it had come from a crashed aircraft, HMS Seraph, submerged. The man who had never lived drifted alone towards the Spanish coast in the April darkness. Spain in 1943 was officially neutral, but neutral meant something complicated in Francisco Franco's Spain. Franco had not joined the Axis powers, but he had not joined the Allies either. His government maintained relations with both sides. German intelligence operated in Spain with a comfort level that made British intelligence uncomfortable and had done so throughout the war.